Hello, hello, all those beautiful faces. My name is Stephanie Edmonds. Welcome to Teaching Liberty. To live free, you have to think free. And that is exactly what we do here on this show. And tonight, I'm here with Spencer, also known as Brutus Yates over in the Twitterverse. I mean, X. I've been calling it X most of these times, and then it just comes out Twitter sometimes. Sorry, Elon, not really. But yes, we are back. We are talking. This is our third show together, and tonight we are going to focus on zoning specifically. I know back in the fall when we had our first conversation, we spent a bit of the show talking about zoning regulations and housing, but there's so much to cover, and it is such a hot topic right now, really nationwide. I know particular we're going to use a couple examples from Connecticut because it really is like regular people are talking about housing legislation. It is a big deal. The zoning regulations, single family zoning, they're talking about how it's racist, of course, and how the state needs more power in order to remedy these issues. So we're going to start with that, and then we're going to pull back and we're going to look at some of the theory, economic theory, and see who's right. Is it the people who are saying the government needs to do more is right? Is it the people who are saying, no, the government needs to stop doing things that are right? So we're going to get into all of that tonight. Make sure you hit that like button if you're finding your way here. Subscribe to the channel and let us know down in that comment section what you think about all of this. And Spencer, thank you so much for joining me.
No problem. Happy to be here.
All right. And just as a reminder for everybody out there, let them know sort of what you bring to this conversation, what your worldview is.
I'm a voluntarist libertarian, and I really enjoy reading about it, particularly on the economic side. And I'm 35. I live in Oregon. I haven't lived here all my life. I moved around a ton, and so I just have a wide variety of perspectives. But I enjoy focusing and reading about the voluntary side.
So if anybody asks you if there's any sane people that live in Oregon, you can say there's at least one.
Yep.
And he's somebody who I often defer to when it comes to economic questions, also very knowledgeable in terms of the history. So I'm so glad to have you on here again tonight. If you haven't seen our past episodes, I recommend going and scrolling through my videos and checking those out. But I want to start off our conversation with an article, one of the articles I sent to you, and I was like, look, this is what people are talking about in Connecticut, and it's housing and segregation and what it has to do with zoning. So we're just going to read through this quick article because I really think it gets to the heart of so many of the talking points that we hear in the national narrative, right? Even though this is specifically about Connecticut, these are the same talking points that you're going to hear nationally. So, starts off by saying the state deserves credit for the release of the Connecticut Housing and Segregation Study. There's one thing government's good at, it is doing
Doing
studies.
studies. Yep.
Hey, it's better than them doing something else, right? I'd rather them do a study and not do the thing. But all right, so they made it public in January. It was a deep dive into the residential housing patterns that reveals historic discrimination that has persisted to the present day and continues to shape our cities and towns. And it says we're among the most segregated states in the union, and this is a common point I know from New York City, because you always hear in New York City, New York City is the most segregated city, right? And I was like, I thought that's why we love New York City. You go to Chinatown, you go to Little Italy, you go to Koreatown. It's like,
Probably
anyway.
depends on how you define it.
Right. Yeah. So they're gonna get into some of these things. And it's true, historically, redlining was a real thing, right? Directed by the federal government. So at the same time, the response to the report shows we still have a long way to go towards closing our state's opportunity gaps and achieving meaningful integration through genuine choices in housing. I thought this was an interesting sentence here, right? Because they mix a lot of language, right? We have to our state has to close opportunity gaps and achieve meaningful integration. It's like, okay, well, who gets to define what is meaningful and what is not? But then also through choices.
Yep.
So
They don't actually talk about the interventions that the state's doing that's restricting their choices.
right, exactly. And so I think the choices to me just feels like a way to throw in like, "Oh, you get to choose," like throw some of that free market stuff, but I don't feel like it is actual genuine choices. Like, you don't have to tell me they're genuine choices because 'cause they're not. Okay, anyways, Ned Lamont, when asked for his response on the study, said he wondered how much of these findings were based on people's choices, right? So, there again, getting into that, is it all about geography and where people live, or is it about self-selection, right? And there's certainly some of that, but then what this author is going to be saying, or this op-ed person is, well, actually, it's because of the history of racism and it's just left over. So, the governor must know our highly segregated communities are the direct result of 20th century federal policies that financed white only suburbs, redlined black neighborhoods, and built the transportation infrastructure that paved over integrated communities and hollowed out America's downtowns. Building on this foundation, our state facilitated many decades. Okay, I want to leave that because this is like I feel like this is a secondary point. I want to know what you feel about this sentence. Like, do you feel I f- I feel like this is the premise of a lot of like systemic racism arguments. What is your take on how valid this premise is?
It is, I would say, half true, and most of it just revolves around like time frame. And so, yes, federally, they did get much more institutionalized in all of these concerns that they're talking about: suburbs, redlining, building transportation infrastructure. Like the 1950s, the Eisenhower administration approved the like Highways Act, and it essentially went through every major U.S. city. I'm not even kidding, every U.S. city, and it decided where are the slums, and guess where the slums are, the quote slums, right? That's where all the poor people or the immigrants or the minorities live, and they gutted it. They say you have to move, get out of here, and they built highways over it because of
Right.
course government controls the roads. But yeah, all of these are true. There's a lot of more localized policies before that, but yeah,
Yeah,
from
I
the federal
remember
standpoint, yep.
on Twitter, I saw this thread recently that showed that. How it showed how it's like, this is what our a beautiful city looks like in America. So quaint and lovely and whatever. And then it's like, this is what it looks like now. And it's just like everything's hollowed out. A huge road is through it. Like, oh, nice. Okay, so right, there's certainly validity to this. And now this is the part where I wonder how much of this is true. Building on this foundation, our state facilitated many decades of exclusionary zoning, allowing suburban communities and their school districts to accumulate wealth and exclude low and moderate income families. And what we're going to find out what they mean by exclusionary zoning is single family zoning, right?
That's the biggest one, but it's a lot of stuff, yeah.
Right. Like in most of these towns, so in Greenwich and New Canaan and Darien, and I mean, if you're from this part of the country, you might be familiar with these towns. These are sort of like outside of New York City. These are in Connecticut. These are the first like very wealthy suburbs that are around here. And the complaint is that they don't build enough like multifamily homes or low income housing for people to access, and everything is single family homes, so you can't build those. Um, And so we're gonna get into that. We're gonna get into discussing that more. And so this person's argument is now bringing these two pieces together. Our choices today are built on that legacy of government-sponsored segregation, exclusion, and racist divestment of Black and Brown communities. And most government policies today continue to perpetuate that separation. How do you feel about that? Do you think that's a valid statement or like half true again or
I mean, all humans are going to choose if they have an option. That's pretty understandable. You could say that like as an a priori knowledge. It exists without any other proof necessary. If you have a choice, the human will make a choice, right? That's pretty understandable. But the problem is, yes, they're putting in all these interventions to restrict choices.
right?
So yeah.
So I guess the difference is like I would make a very similar argument to this, except my conclusion would be so the government should stop doing any state sponsored things, right? Whereas this person's argument is like, well, the government just needs to do different things because if they do different things, then they won't end up doing this, right?
Yes,
Um
this is most of like the YIMBY type talk, the yes in my backyard, which is the opposite of no in my backyard.
Yeah. Oh,
Um,
yes, in
so
my backyard? I've never
yeah.
heard
You've
this.
never heard
Yippies?
YIMBY? Yeah,
No, I've heard of
there's
NIMBYs.
there's YIMBYs all over the country now, which is both good and bad. But instead of occasionally they'll talk about restrictions and loosening them, but most of the time they just want subsidized housing. So
Okay.
it's a mixed bag.
Um so yeah, it's basically saying here, residents, they want to move out of Hartford, which is like one of the poorest cities in Connecticut, if not, I think it's after Bridgeport and New Haven, actually. So Hartford, it's a pretty poor city in Connecticut. They're saying, most of these people want to move out, or 65% of the people surveyed said that they wanted to move out, but they can't afford to, they can't find a place they can afford in the suburbs. So they're saying down here, um, is that
Yeah,
where
and I agree with
was
that because the next article goes into some of those details about Hartford in particular. But yeah, the zoning in
yeah.
large municipalities like Hartford have worse outcomes because of that density.
Yeah, so basically they're saying that many suburbs shun new housing, particularly multifamily developments that could be affordable for many people who live in cities. Strict zoning codes bring exclusionary results with effect of segregating Connecticut by race and income levels. So
Yep.
this is and so you agree with that?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. They prevent new building of housing, including multifamily. They have height restrictions. They have percent sizability within, like, let's say you have to have a quarter acre lot, and every quarter acre, only 20% of it can be housing. They prevent, building multiple, like side housing or like a step parent or maybe a friend type shack in the back that's smaller. They prevent adding height, so they have height restrictions. They have all of these problems. Yep.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right, that you agree with, like, the way that this person indicts the problem. And I think that a lot of conservatives, right, conservatives or even people who aren't conservatives, because I found that in Connecticut, this isn't really like a Democrat Republican issue. Like, there's certain people who are like, I guess, like on the far left, but, like, just regular people, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, I mean, Connecticut's highly Democrat, they they live in their houses, they've lived there a long time, and they have property value based on these things, and they don't have the expectation that down the street or across the street or next door, all of a sudden is gonna go up a huge apartment building, right? A multifamily building or some low income, subsidized housing thing.
Or
Um,
having multi-use. Yep. Like in
yes.
large cities and many European type cities before zoning was official, they have multi-use, and they have like quaint little, might call it cute or pretty little cities where you have like a shop on the bottom and maybe some housing on the top, and maybe above that you have some energy production or water facility. Yeah, there's multi-use.
Right, so but just people, I guess, yeah, they don't want that, right? They want their neighborhood, like their single family neighborhood, and I don't know, I see that too, especially if we're working in an imperfect environment, right? Like, it's not like we can this is the hard thing about being a libertarian or thinking from the libertarian perspective is like, well, we don't live in a libertarian society, right? So you're not choosing between like a perfect libertarian world and whatever choice is being presented. You're choosing between like one statist existence and another statist existence. And and so it's
Yep.
like I feel like the current statist existence is better than like some enforced high density statist, experience.
Yeah, I guess it just depends on the more rules, the worse it'll be, is probably a good trend. Yep.
Yeah, so we can look at real quick of a few more of the specifics and then let's zoom out and talk like more about the theory of zoning. We've started to get into a little bit of it here and there, but I want to, finish this. We'll put it to the side. We'll get into the theory of zoning and then we'll circle back and try to decide, what the proper conclusion is. I mean, I have my biases, but also I genuinely am torn, like when you're applying that theory, right? Like that pure theory to the playing field that we're in, right? Like it's like I'm choosing between two evils. Um,
Yep.
and then when you do that, then people are like, well, you're not a real libertarian or, whatever. I mean, I'm a registered Democrat. So.
Yep. Gotta the restrictions on voting and ballot access make it difficult to actually be in a party that you would like to be in. Yep.
So, all right. So this is from Mises Institute, right? Whereas the previous one that we read was in a Hearst media publication, and the person definitely had like what I would consider like a lefty bias, right? So now we're hearing from somebody who's on a different side of the spectrum for sure, like more libertarian side. John Kennedy. That's not the Senator John Kennedy though.
No, no, no,
Okay.
no. He's a grad student, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so it says there's no shortage of experts that the government is willing to hire to gain public favor for a particular policy. Oh, yes, they love to do that. For Connecticut, that expert is named Cameron Rifkin, a policy associate for the National Council of State Legislatures. On December 4th, 2023, at a legislative roundtable discussion on housing, Mr. Rifkin spoke of the grim reality of the housing situation in Connecticut, stating 68% of renters in Connecticut with extremely low income are severely cost burdened, spending 50% of household income on rent. About 13% of middle income households are paying 30% or more in rent. An income of 66,000 is needed to afford a two-bedroom rental. Right? So, I mean, yeah, like housing is expensive. I'm definitely um very glad that I was able to uh, buy a house or buy a condo before the pandemic, so prices were still reasonable and rates were reasonable, and it brought my monthly costs down by about like $500 for my housing costs. So oof, man, times are tough.
Yep.
Other problems presented at the table included a deficit of 89,000 housing units for low income people and zoning laws preventing larger multifamily problems from being built. Mr. Rifkin presented some solutions, including promoting workforce and multifamily housing, transit oriented development, and loosening zoning laws. However, he stated there is no real one size fits all and no magic solution. Is that true? No, Mr. Rifkin is wrong. The magic answer lies with the very reason there's a housing problem in the first place: government policy. Instead of merely saying this is a nationwide problem and therefore any real solution is out of our hands, current economic policy should be examined. Right? And so they go through property taxes, and our property taxes in Connecticut are outrageous, and they keep going up.
I think they're the
Construction costs.
second highest in the nation is what they said, yeah.
Okay, second highest in the nation. Yes, like Connecticut is such an expensive place to live. It's pretty crazy. Low income families have been the driving force behind political action. Um,
Sub
Connecticut's capital. Did you have something?
I was gonna say subsidized housing, that's Section 8. Yep,
Yeah, Section 8, exactly. They Hartford has the highest amount of Section 8 in the state at 40.8%. The
it's a lot.
median income of yeah, it's like 50%, like almost half of all the really, really poor people live in Hartford. Like Hartford is not a good place to be. It's not great at all. Um,
Yep, and
so
all the subsidies come with strings attached, and that's part of the problem. It incentivizes people not to be productive, essentially. Anywhere there's a subsidy, you are incentivizing people not to be productive.
yeah, so
Yep,
it says residents on Section 8 have no reason to increase their productivity. Otherwise, they will lose their benefits if their income exceeds that of the median.
yep.
Um, I mean, yeah, I don't know how you solve that problem, like
Get rid of the subsidies.
getting rid of it at
Yeah,
all. Yeah. Um, so but basically, they talk about all of these other things that are going on that people don't really think about when they think about housing, right? The property taxes, and then the other subsidies that the government provides around housing. I thought it was interesting though, because they don't at all address the zoning thing, right? Because I mean, he's here saying that we need to loosen our zoning laws, and their main thesis is like we need to get rid of laws. So they don't take the time to acknowledge that agreement at all.
yeah. Zoning is like a big topic. Maybe that's why I'm not sure why they didn't talk about it in this one article. I mean, they talk about construction costs and public works, so that's like part of it.
Yeah,
Because
no, I
yeah,
thought it was great in that sense, because I don't think people think about these things at all when they think about housing costs, right? So, okay, like there's all these other things that are going on in the state, but I felt like when we were looking at this article before this, one of our main points where we're like, this guy's really diagnosing the problem well, right? The state intervention has caused all this discrimination, and zoning policies are discriminatory. Like, yes. And then his answer is like, well, the state just makes different zoning policies, right? Um, but I guess like the different zoning policies in a lot of these places, the problem isn't that they just want to get rid of zoning. They want to get rid of zoning, but then also give builders special privileges
yep,
to build, and subsidies, and then they're supposed to be following rules, and they don't even follow those rules to like put in the low income housing. So there's all these different layers. I actually talked about it 2 nights ago on a podcast with a local grassroots organization, CT169, who, like, advocates kind of against a lot of this nonsense, but then also, like, for, I would say, maintaining a lot of, like, the current zoning that we do have, which isn't, like, the pure libertarian solution.
yep. Surprise, surprise. Regulations actually hurt everyone, the consumers, and they actually help the businesses, the big businesses. Unfortunately, most of America doesn't understand that. They want more regulation. If we could make everything is perfectly safe, but
Yeah,
no,
right?
that's not how it works. Yep. Sure.
All right, well, let's just talk about zoning more generally. I feel like we've laid the groundwork here about sort of like what the narrative is. We've given some specific examples in Connecticut about what's going on, laid out some of the main, this is what the statist side thinks, mostly the Democrat side, right? It's like mostly Democrats, I would say, that are driving a lot of these like low income sort of like housing. There's a housing crisis problem. I mean, that's what I'm seeing. I'm sure the Republicans aren't innocent. Um,
Yeah, they're both at fault.
yeah,
Unf it's hard to say though because it's heavily biased towards big cities, and, most big cities
right, are
are
Democrat.
Democratic.
So
Yep.
it's kinda how the chips fall. But yeah, let's just talk about zoning and put out some of the more of the history and define some things.
Yeah. You wanna pull up the slides?
Yeah.
Do you wanna cover, like, what it is or the oranges first? Or which one?
Um, well, I think that I like this one right here with the 75% of the residential.
Oh, yeah. And this came from CNN, so they're starting to understand even the propaganda site CNN. Mainstream corporate media is understanding the problems.
Well, you can find good articles on any of these things. It's just about being able to determine like, "Oh, is this one of the good things?" You know? So this is a good chart here that shows that, um, s
Yeah, you can see all the pink
yeah,
color is it's specifically zoned for detached single family homes. So you can see how much it takes up in each of these major cities. But it's pretty sad just how much it can take up. And I think most people here understand just how bad like San Jose and Seattle, things like that are in terms of housing prices. So it
okay.
makes good sense.
I know. It's like I mean, I live in a condo, so it's not like single family detached. Um, but it's also not like an apartment building either. Um, I could not imagine living in an apartment building. I mean, for like long term, like I did it for a little bit, like when I was like young in my 20s. Couldn't imagine. I just feel like when I drive through these cute little neighborhoods, I'm just like, "Oh, it's so nice."
Yeah, it's product differentiation is nice for meeting everyone's needs, right? Not
Alright.
everyone gets a mansion, not everyone gets a single family house, not
Yeah, I don't
everyone gets
like
a
houses
yeah.
that are too big. I'm like, when they're too big, I'm just like, "Alright, this is a little excessive here, guys." Unless you have, like, multi-generations living all here. It's a little or no, what's worse though than just, like, a big house on a big piece of property is when the property's, like, not big. It's like, like half an acre and the house is on the whole freaking thing. I'm just like, "Oh, did you want a little house with that yard?" You know?
Yep. Some
Um
people want more yard, some people want more house. It all varies. Yep.
I love how you're just like, "Oh, yeah, there's people with choices." I'm like that person who walks around the neighborhood, I'm like, "Ugh, I would never have that color shutters."
Yep.
But this is a good graphic. I've never thought about this statistic before, how it's in cities. Like, New York City, you can see is obviously the most densely populated. I think it gives you a good comparison. And Washington DC too. Washington DC is a pretty cute city. The way that they have it with all those little like rows of houses and stuff, and they have little yards sometimes in the front.
Yeah, I lived in one of those in a basement in one for a while.
Okay, okay. Nice. Alright, so that's what we have in terms of, just, like, some context for what cities look like and your average city. That's 75% of most cities are single family, and so that's really what this battle is over right now, is over that single family zoning, and the argument is most of this is left over from redlining, which
Um,
there is some validity to that.
so redlining technically is different than zoning, but they're very similar. Yeah.
Okay, because
Yeah.
so they are somewhat conflating that argument then, right? Like the redlining and the current day zoning, but you rated it about 50% because I would imagine that if people have had their houses for a long time, certain people were able to get loans at certain prices and certain others that you could buy into a neighborhood or not buy into a neighborhood, and if yeah.
Yeah, the to go quickly over what redlining is. So in the New Deal policies under Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the Great Depression in the 30s, one of them was creating this federal agency called the FHA. I think it was Federal Housing Agency. I think
Mhm.
it may have changed names because a lot of them do change names over time. But back then, um, they they worked to subsidize housing. One of the ways was to essentially guarantee mortgages if you meet a long laundry list of rules. And one of those rules was it had to have a particular either type of zoning or it had to exclude, um, like it couldn't allow segregation type of stuff, or it couldn't allow integration of different immigrants or minorities and stuff like that. So it wasn't only blacks, but it was also like Chinese and Jews and Irish and all sorts of stuff like that.
And so oh, it said this in the federal regulation. It was like,
In
"We'll only give
order
you this loan if you live in a Chinese-only community or a black-only community."
Yeah, and the FHA didn't. Well, they did have some subsidized housing, but they didn't actually give most of the loans. They guaranteed it. You remember how they guaranteed a lot of the student debt, which is why we have like a student debt crisis. How they guaranteed a lot of the other issues that have caused our problems. Well,
Yeah.
essentially, once they do that, then all of the private banks won't give a mortgage unless the government guarantees it. And so it becomes, and if it's not guaranteed by the government, then all of a sudden the price is, a lot more. So yeah.
Alright. Okay, so that's some of the history of redlining. Let's talk a little bit more about I mean, the I would imagine there are some good things about zoning, right? Like, I mean, again, it just when I go and I think about my town, and we have some places that are mixed use, right? You know, usually it's like around the downtown area and then like a little bit out from there and then like up the main road to the highway. There's like, mixed use along that, but then behind there it's mostly like single family, housing and yeah, I would say usually it's like on the outside of a little single family neighborhood, there's like some multifamily. Like where I live, it's like a couple of multifamily places, like more on the main streets, and then you go back a little bit and it's like a bunch of single family. And I wouldn't and then we have industrial places, like places that are like pretty heavy in industry, right? And like I wouldn't want to live near one of those heavy industry places. You know what I mean?
Yeah, this is your so to talk about the pro case for zoning,
Y
right?
Yeah, like, it
Yeah,
just
that's
feels like or even back here, there's, like, this neighborhood that's, like, back in here, it's, like, single family houses, like, I couldn't imagine, like, if one of those people, like, decide to sell their house and knock it down and put up a huge thing, like, I mean, there are
yeah.
some up on the main road. There's definitely some up, like, on this main road up here, but it's, like, I don't know, it just wouldn't be right if it was in here.
I mean, personally, using government to enact zoning, there's nothing good about it. But we can talk about like the reasons for it. And there's a Supreme Court case from 1926, which was like the most important Supreme case on this Supreme Court case, and it was Euclid versus Amber Realty Company. And there's like a brick manufacturer that had built its own factory in a location before anyone else was anywhere near it. And then a realty company was starting to build houses, but people were like, "Oh, I don't want to live next to a brick factory." And so they ended up taking it to the Supreme Court, and they actually approved zoning laws. And so it spread. It was already starting to spread up until then, but then after that, it just went wild, and
So
now
wait, they
everyone, yeah,
kicked out the brick factory?
yeah.
That's
So
messed
yeah,
up.
these zoning rules, people think, well, I don't want to live next to something noisy or tall or with a smokestack or whatever you want to call it. But the problem is that they're enacting rules to prevent uh, property rights adjudication, but that was all done before. They have common law, and the local institutions would go to arbitration and be like, this guy, my neighbor, won't agree that he's using 10% of my canal to feed his plants. And then they would either discuss it amongst themselves as neighbors, or they would take it to arbitration, and the common law would be like, okay, well, you have to do this or you have to do that, and they settled. But um, now instead they wanted a top down, okay, you can only build here if you meet XYZ criteria. And that causes all sorts of problems, which you can talk about. But yeah, the pro case for zoning is that it makes it better. So there's no conflict, there's no safety hazards.
Mm.
Yeah.
And what about we have some areas too, like the other place I would say that I could see like a pro argument is uh, for like the watershed. Like we have some towns where, and there's this rule or this law in Connecticut that all towns 10% of their housing stock is supposed to be affordable housing. Well, we have some places where 75% of their town is like watershed. Like you can't build on it because it's like that's where we all get our drinking water from, you know? So it just feels like, there could be in that case, right, zoning to protect that area and then other areas too. So sometimes I would say the thing is that they bring in these new buildings and it puts stress on the infrastructure, which then cause environmental problems, right? So we want zoning to protect our rivers and our water supply.
Yeah, protecting basically property rights is what you're saying. That's the argument for zoning, but they find that it's actually the opposite. You are trying to force down um, someone else's your property rights. So the
Mm,
way to the, having definable and exclusionary property rights is how you prevent conflict. When there's leeway between that is when conflict occurs, and that's what the zoning is actually doing. It's saying, hey, you have a house there, you have a house there, but you're not allowed to do anything with it unless a legislator, a bureaucrat, or 50, 60, 70% of the population says you can do that. And you can imagine how many problems that causes downstream, right? Instead of just
right,
having two neighbors talk it out. Let's say you're making a lot of noise. Well, you can build a wall. You can cut down on the noise. You can add more insulation. You can take the noise elsewhere. But instead, we're going to enact it for everyone. And if you want an exemption, you have to pay a hefty fine and go through 3 years of permits.
right. Or, what the developers do is they fund all these like astroturf groups and nonprofit organizations and hire a bunch of lobbyists. And then it's just this like big like circle jerk between like their nonprofits and like the legislatures. And then it's like the person's husband or wife sits on it's like, it's big money, it's big money, and they use people who are, you know, poor and desperate situations as cover. "Oh, we're just trying to help these people, right? There's a housing crisis, and they need our help."
That's always the masking they do. Yep. It's for safety, it's for helping. Yep. But it actually
S
hurts.
yeah, so, uh let's talk about well, we've talked a lot, I feel like, even though I was giving a lot of the pro stuff, like, I feel like we talked about in there a lot of, like, the bad consequences. What I thought was really interesting was that Supreme Court case. So why don't we talk a little bit more about the history of zoning and how it evolved to come today, because I think a lot of the things, if you've just always lived with that the way it is, right? Oh, this is single family zoning and this is multi-use zoning and this is industrial and that's just how your world is. Like you don't even know what to question. You're like, "Oh, it's just always the way it's been." So why don't we talk about some of the cases or some of the things that have happened in history that have led to the evolution of the zoning laws, and then discuss like, well, if they didn't do that, what would be the alternative, right? Like things like accidents and fires. Like if the government didn't do these regulations as a result, like wouldn't more of those things happen? What could we do otherwise?
Yeah, totally. Um, so the biggest, I'd say, overall trend of zoning throughout the past like several hundred years has been urbanization. So before the Industrial Revolution, pretty much everyone was living in an agrarian or rural area. And there were cities, but they were rare and they were usually small compared to what we call today cities of like millions of people. Their city was like 10,000 people. Um, and so when that changed, it causes a lot more density. And the other aspect of that was it caused a lot more integration of people that don't necessarily want to be around other specific types of people. Discrimination, right? But instead of working it out amongst themselves, they're using government to enforce the discrimination, right? And so that's the general trends of why it's happening. Um, Now, there were a lot of small cases in the early Industrial Revolution era, like early 1800s, late 1700s, of local rules made that weren't necessarily called zoning, but they would just say, okay, well, you're not allowed to put up a table here and sell oranges. And that wasn't necessarily zoning, but that's how they got rid of maybe merchants or immigrants trying to set up shop at a particular spot.
Right,
Um,
because it's a public sidewalk, is that the argument that so the government can make laws there?
uh, I don't even think they had that much thought behind what law could be made and what law could not be made. It was just I'm mayor or I'm king and I can do whatever I want type of thing. Because
Right.
yeah,
Well, it is kind of annoying though, right? Like, if you're if there's, like, meant to be a place where you're supposed to be walking and people, like, set up shop on it? I don't know.
well, that's
What's
the problem
you
of
know?
tragedy of the commons, but that's why having public property is a problem. Yeah.
Okay, so
So
just no public property.
yes, totally would be ideal. Then private institutions have the motivation to conserve their property because there is no motivation to conserve it if you're using other people's money and you have no personal accountability if there's problems with it. You're just relying on bureaucrats and legislation to do it for you.
And so then, like, theoretically, if somebody wanted to set up their little stand to sell fruit or newspapers or something, they could go to the business owner and be like, "Hey, I see you have a nice little slice of sidewalk. Like, people could totally still walk by and access your business, and, I could sell my newspapers here and whatever, pay you a percentage or a fee or something like that."
Yep, totally. And it doesn't always have to involve money. It can, yeah. I'm sure if there's a lot of demand for it, they're going to charge money to cause the demand to go down because when you raise prices, demand goes down. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. But
Right,
just to
okay,
get
there
back
could
to
be
like,
some sort of mutual relationship, whatever that is, something mutually beneficial.
yeah. And so that's kind of how it previously worked. Is they had um, property rights in some sense. In a lot of cases, it was like a feudal aristocratic um, environment where there was a lot of public property, but a a prince or a king or um, a mayor, whatever you want to call it, some local institution decided what could happen there, what could not, and he didn't arbitrate law unless he or she saw it as a problem. So people complaining to him, or he just didn't like it, or whatever.
So
But
is that good or bad? You're advocating for monarchy now, is that what you're saying?
not advocating for monarchy, not advocating for democracy either. I'm advocating for property rights, and so that's what was not existing. Um, And so you can also have cases where there were no government institutions, like Western territories in the U.S. is an excellent example. Before they became states, it was arbitrated on property rights alone, just common law and dealing with your neighbors. You set up zones and defined your property, your homesteading, and when you build up, particularly in areas like California and the ranching in Pacific Northwest and up in Montana, Wyoming area. They had their own cultures and institutions. The Native Americans there, um, they
They
surely it was
welcome them, they love them, they all got along great, didn't
no,
they?
they did not. Um, the issue was when they started interfering in those property rights. Um,
When
so
who did? Who started
both
interfering?
both sides, yeah,
Okay, both
both
sides.
sides, yeah.
Okay, so
There were some very peaceful Indians. I think the favorite one I've read about is Nez Perce. They were in Idaho, and they were very peaceful, and they wanted to trade, and they got a lot of benefit from working with a lot of the fur traders and the other. Um, Back then, they were also trying to build like uh, railroads and other transportation routes and boating. But yeah, trading um, was a big deal. But then they had all others like the Sioux Indians. I think are historically seen as like the most violent. But that was just part of their culture, right? But they got along with other Indians by respecting each other's property rights. Essentially, it was when U.S. Uh, deemed it their land, or they had purchased it
right.
from Spain or France or whatever, and decided, oh, now it's ours. Um, but yeah, it's the lack of property rights that causes conflict. So yeah, to get back to the zoning aspect, back in roughly the 1800s, mid 1800s, is when there was a lot more urbanization, lot more, and um, a couple crises happen when you put a bunch of people in an area, and just normal environmental problems occur, as well as just people having more conflicts. And so that's what generally happened. There was a lot of fires, which had occurred before, but now there's a lot more people density that are building. And back then, it was almost all wood. Now they have cement buildings, we have steel buildings, but back then even the roads and the sidewalks had a lot of wood, and so that's just how the bridges were a lot of wood. Um, and so when a fire happened, it was a bigger deal. So they had several fires. The two biggest ones that I've read about that occurred a huge transformation in what they call zoning or building codes as well. Building codes is separate from zoning. Um, was around the 1870s. In particular, there was two fires actually, but they occurred under the same storm. It's funny. October 8th, 1871. It had been dry for almost the whole summer and fall, and October 8th, two of the biggest fires in terms of damage occurred in U.S. history. Prestigo fire, which is in northeast Wisconsin, but it actually burned a lot more. It burned up into like the Canada as well. And then Chicago, which is in Illinois, right on the Great Lakes there. And it in Prestigo, it killed more people, um, but in Chicago, it uh, burned down more buildings because it was a bigger city. Prestigo is mainly like a lumberyard city, um, but it killed more people there because of lack of ability to go anywhere else. And then in Chicago, people were able to get outside of their homes while it was burning, but essentially it consumed uh, almost the whole city of Chicago. Like I have a picture in there too, but if you look at it, it was like everything on everything close to the Great Lakes. And it was 3.3 square miles, thousands of buildings and homes. Almost their whole population was left homeless and started um, looking for more places to live. And so
Wow,
those
amazing.
after that, uh, I recently read a very cool book about the fire in Chicago, so that's why I was talking about that one in particular. But yeah, after this, the old quote that libertarians like to use: "Never let a crisis go to waste." And so they enacted a whole bunch of different rules. The mayor took control of the town. He established martial law. He prohibited. He had set price controls. He prohibited certain activities, particularly at night. Yeah, it was a big problem. But essentially, they took that as advantage to take out all the people they didn't like. There were a lot of Irish immigrants, a lot of German immigrants. They didn't like Catholics at the time. Most of America was Protestant, and all the immigrants were. Um, some of the immigrants that they didn't like were Catholic. And so they used that as advantage to discriminate in a lot of those cases. And then the Industrial Revolution continued, more migration to cities. After the Civil War, a lot of the Black population from the South migrated both to West and Northern territories. And then after World War One, there was another massive uh, urbanization of the U.S. And all of those incrementally caused more zoning laws, building codes, urban planning type stuff.
And yeah, I mean, sometimes the way that you see wires and this and that done, you're like, oh, I don't know about this. And so basically, you're saying that the alternative to this is just people working things out and holding each other accountable. I mean, is that effective? Like, especially at scale, in these slums and stuff? Especially, like, say you have a bunch of people who are immigrants living all in a building, they may not speak the language well, they're basically just focused on working all day to make enough money to feed their family and then do it all over again. So, how are they gonna hold, their person, their, uh, landlord accountable? And if it's a bunch of slumlords and, if the building burns down, they get insurance, not really a big deal. Like, what's the incentive if there's no government to come and be like, hey, you need to keep this building up to code? Even if the government doesn't do it all the time, like, wouldn't they do it more than these people who are these very poor people who have no idea?
Yeah, product differentiation and insurance companies will establish those type of quality that you were asking about.
Okay,
And
so
so
the insurance companies would be the ones who would have a very high vested interest.
those are one of the primary factors, yes, but also just different product differentiation. It doesn't have to be straight from a so-called slum to a single family home, but there's a wide variety. For certain prices you can get a certain quality of housing, and you can even build it yourself, right? Building a shack isn't not all that difficult for most adults that are able to move and have a couple tools. So
Yeah,
yeah,
but, like, if you're in a city, though, like a high density city, like, I don't know if you're gonna be, like, building your house, right?
yeah, we're I guess we're not necessarily talking about the same time frame. I'm still back in the 1800s
Yeah,
here,
like, I
but
guess you're in the 1800s, you're just like, "Oh, this
yeah.
looks like a good spot right here," you know?
Yeah, today,
Like
I don't even think you would be able to, find a piece of land in a city that was open to just putting something on,
no, you can just take somebody
unfortunately.
else's house these days. Have you seen all that
Oh,
squatter
jeez.
stuff?
Yeah, that's another there you go, another property rights violation. But
Yeah.
yeah, in the current method, um, this goes way beyond, zoning per se, but the government ownership of transportation, whether it's a canal or railroad, um, roads themselves, car roads. It causes a lot of prevention of open land for other uses. And then the zoning too. I mean, you have it either commercial, industrial, or residential. There's oh yeah, now we're getting into like how it affects all of these different types of more housing and also um, differentiated housing, right? So if you set up a restriction, you're going to cause a lower supply. It's not really. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that. Unfortunately, they always use the propaganda of it's safer or it's better or we're helping people, but the way
Right,
to
where
help,
helping
yeah,
people is really the biggest one, right? Like, these people can't afford housing.
yep,
Uh,
the social mobility is what they're preventing. So essentially, they're eliminating all of the poorest people, and instead of trying to allow them a social ladder of here you can live in this like temporary slum for a few months or a few years while you save up enough to buy some mediocre land, which is how it used to be. But now it's so restrictive that unless you make almost six figures in most cities, you really can't afford a house or a condo.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was watching something depressing about, like, how you need to how, like, making low 6 figures is, like, barely middle class these days. I was like, "Oh, we struggling out here."
Yep.
But yeah, like, it used to be housing cost was, like, equal to 1.5 or 2.5 years of your salary, something like that, and now it's, like, a decade or something like that. It's like, you used to be able to get a house for like 30 grand, and now it's 566,000 is like the median. It's like, woo.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about supply restrictions, but that also goes into uh, demand increases too. Yeah, and the central banking has a lot of problems that cause it too.
Yeah,
Like,
we can do a
look,
whole different one on the
yeah,
on the central bank.
yep,
So basically, end of the day, right? We're looking if the biggest thing everybody's complaining about the supply being restricted, right?
hmm
And one side, and it's interesting because the side that's saying they need more government intervention is also saying the previous government intervention of these zoning laws is what was the problem. And then
yep.
you have the other side that's basically just saying, like, we don't want change, we just want things to stay how they are, and I tend to find myself on that side because I'm like, like, things aren't great how they are now, but I feel like if we get rid of the zoning laws, it's actually going to open up the floodgates for more government intervention. So, like, that it can be kind of counterintuitive in that way. But what I mean by that is because all of the people who are then going to be allowed to build on these pieces of land are gonna be approved by the government. So it's gonna be the government's handpicked developers, and they're gonna have these certain law rules that they're supposed to do, this much low income and this much, but really they're just putting up luxury housing, right? And so that's why, even though I'm like, okay, yeah, theoretically, like, we shouldn't really have single family housing. In this situation, I feel like it's the better thing to do. Like, same thing, there's this law being proposed that churches can build up to 8 units of like homeless shelters on their property, right? So it's like theoretically a church should be able to do whatever they want, right? But the problem is that when the church builds these shelters on their property, now you're bringing in people that wouldn't otherwise be there, and they're going to require other free resources that are going to be paid by your tax dollars, right? So that's why I'd be against, like, allowing a church to, like, theoretically use their property how they want to, because it just adds more liabilities on the people in that town. I don't know if you agree with that.
I mean, we're mixing a lot of different topics, but the free resources is part of the problem. Um, the more we can chip away at the restrictions on supply and the subsidization of demand, the better. So if if they want to slightly reduce zoning but slightly increase giveaways, then that's not going to really help. You got to ideally you get rid of both, but if you can slightly chip away zoning but not give any more free handouts, that'd be even better. But the more we can subtract from the situation. Yep.
So, yeah, I guess, like, in this case, then I am gonna kind of have to still stick with the people who want to, like, maintain zoning how it is, because it sort of, like, maintains the status quo, like, versus, like I said, sort of opening the floodgates to more special favors and more deals and probably more other, hidden, um what was I gonna say? Like, hidden zoning stuff, right? It's like it seems like, oh, we're getting rid of single family zoning, but they're adding in all sorts of other regulations and qualifications and this and that. And oh, and they're going to be turning, the main street into a greenway, right? You're no longer allowed to like drive through Main Street or whatever. They're, like, taking away all the parking in our downtown. It's so annoying. They're like, "Park in the garages." I'm like, "No, I want my street parking in front of the business."
That's yeah, I mean, it all goes back to property rights. If someone buys a piece of property and they're not harming anyone else, then they can do whatever they want with it. The problem is when they have those externalities if they're harming someone else. So you don't need to prevent that from happening. They have existing rules and you don't even it's a common law. It's how it existed before is where you when in the before the 1700s when they had these institutions where it was basically just rule and any public land was owned by an aristocrat. The aristocrat usually didn't intervene, but and so they had common law. That's how common law developed. You have these neighbors that say, okay, well, in our little community of 200 people, we're going to allow this, but we're not going to allow that. And if there's any disagreements, um, leaders slowly emerged that gave good decisions, and they would agree if there was a conflict, they would go to some tribal leader and decide, hey, we're not going to allow this and we'll allow that. And the punishments were voluntarily held. It was essentially ostracification, where essentially, if you're part of a trade network and you conducted something against that trade network, you're no longer part of that trade network.
But does that
If
scale? Does that scale to 200,000? Does that scale to 2,000,000, right? And when does that aristocrat who you seem to be framing in, like, a pretty good light, at least in this context. Like, I'm sure there's other things that he's doing, like, outside of this context that, like, aren't so great, but, like, at least in this role, you seem to be suggesting that there is somebody who needs to have a monopoly on the power,
no,
right? I guess
it was given by government, like it was a prince or it was some like cousin of a favorite merchant that he had. It wasn't voluntarily given. I'm saying,
yeah.
um, and if you just take from an individual level, like all economics can be broken down into the individual level. It's just between two people, and then you grow it. So in a lot of the economic textbooks, they talk about using the example of like Robinson Crusoe, right? He's on an isolated island and he has to make food. So how is he going to make food? Well, he can catch a fish with his hand. Okay, great. Well, that's only so much productive. Maybe he can get one or two fish a day. But now he wants to be more productive, so he's going to forego consuming fish for a day and he's going to weave himself a net. And so he became more productive by foregoing consumption, adding in a productive tool, and now he can catch 10 fish a day. And so he doesn't need a fish all day. Now he can build a little hut for himself. So yeah, you start at the base level, an individual, then you add in one person. Okay, now another person is stranded with Robinson Crusoe, and they decide that on this part of the island he can do whatever he wants. On that part of the island they can do whatever they want. And then you just keep adding in more people, but it all starts it's called methodological individualism. But essentially all problems can be broken down into
I know,
there's
but
a
what
conflicting
happened.
party.
Oh, go ahead. No, go,
there's a
finish.
con there's a conflicting party with another conflicting party, and they need arbitration.
But what happens when you don't start with a deserted island and you start with a city full of people and regulations and zoning? How does that equation work? That is the question that I feel like I'm gonna continue to ask and work through, as I'm always balancing, we call them libertarian, but they're like pure free economic, principles, pure sort of like Republican, Democratic principles, and then our actual reality of life, right? That's something that we all have to do. I'd be curious, anybody who's out there, how do you think that we can properly balance our ideals, our principles, our values, and the reality that we have to deal with, right? That road of reform. Or are you just ready to say, F it, let's have a revolution and whatever happens, happens. I'm not there yet. I'm not there. But Spencer, this conversation's been great. I had a lot of fun. Um, I feel like I do pretty good and genuinely so, like at playing like the devil's advocate and asking the questions about like, but government can be good sometimes, maybe. Maybe not. And you always come with the big facts and history and all that. I was thinking maybe next time, I know in our first video, we had gone through the example of the Chicago manufacturing district that was in the early 1900s. So, and I know you said that there are actually other examples of places that operated as, what would you call them? Like, more or less pure free markets, right? Or
Yeah.
more or less, like, based on property rights.
Mhm.
Yeah, so maybe we can do something like that, like run through some other examples, look at pictures, and really see how this can function at scale. Because that is something that I am skeptical of. I am skeptical of how you achieve, like when I look around place like New York City, in some places I'm like, it's a pretty like libertarian paradise. There's people like riding all over the sidewalk and weaving in and out of places and whatever, so many things going on, but at the same time there's so many rules and laws and regulations and this and that, so it's like not really. I just don't know how that place could work though sometimes if there weren't those rules and laws and regulations, right? It gives you a baseline. But we shall see next time. I keep an open mind. That's what we have to do here. Thank you. Thank everybody out there for checking in. Again, if you haven't hit that like button, make sure you do. If you're new, subscribe to the channel. This is what we do. We look into different issues and facts from different perspectives. Usually going live on Monday nights. This week has been a crazy week. This is my third live this week, but I thought it was perfect because just the other night we did a housing one from a grassroots organization. Me and you have been talking about this issue, and we discussed it from more of a theoretical standpoint, historical standpoint. So I felt like these two went really well together. Um, Plug your stuff real quick. Where can people find you?
Oh, I guess on Twitter, Yates_Brutus would be the best place. Yeah.
Yep, and I have that linked in the description down below, and you're going to be having a paper coming out soon, so maybe people can see some of your credits maybe sometime, maybe not. And until next time, make sure that you live free, think free, and give all the glory to God. Gotta find the end.